What's up, guys, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. If you want to get into DAWless music production and are trying to figure out if you should even do so, and if so, where to start, this is the video for you. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Let's start with what kind of DAWless production you're trying to get into, because there are multiple approaches that you can take, and these will have radically different processes and even outcomes in terms of sound. And you might not even want to go 100% DAWless, and you might want to adopt a hybrid approach, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So first of all, there is the very minimalist, entirely self-contained DAWless workflow, and this often comes in the form of the Groove Box. This is stuff like the Innovation Circuit, the Korg Electribe, Roland MC101, OP1, Model Cycles, MPC1, Machine Plus, and so on and so forth. Other similar devices that are entirely self-contained, can just work by themselves without the aid of a computer, and you can make entire songs on them. This is the entry point for a lot of people, the gateway drug, if you will, and it's a great one. For one thing, it often can replicate a DAW-like experience, which is great for people kind of the younger generation of producers like myself. It can be minimalist and uncomplicated, which I definitely like. I like it when the workflow of something just kind of disappears, and I can just put all my focus on making music once I've gotten to know a device. And they offer room to grow into the next category of DAWless music production, which is a more spread out setup with multiple devices, but using a groove box as the brain or central hub of the entire setup. Pretty much every groove box out there not only has built-in drum machines, synthesizers, and sequencers, but also MIDI outputs and abilities to sequence other gear. So if you already have a groove box, you can get a hardware synth, some effects units, and all that other kind of stuff, and start building out a bigger setup. And of course, you will need to record this somehow. Some people will do this also DAWlessly, like they'll use a mixer and then just record that stereo output, or they'll use a mixer to record multiple channels, or you could just get an audio interface, and you're starting to get a little bit into hybrid workflow territory, where you record the individual tracks and then polish them in a DAW afterwards. But that's not the only way to do a DAWless setup. Some devices allow you to streamline this quite a bit. Stuff like the Circuit Tracks not only allows you to sequence external gear, but also bring that audio back in to get processed by, in this case, the Circuit Tracks. It acts as the sequencer and the mixer. It kind of amalgamates stuff into itself, and it makes for a really clean, cable efficient setup that I really enjoy, and it got me into the whole table full of gear approach when previously I wasn't particularly interested in that. It's also worth mentioning that the Korg Electribe 2, which is a bit older, also has some of these capabilities, although it only has one input. And I should also mention, in terms of brains of a setup, Arturia and Electron also make a bunch of stuff that's well known for this. I just haven't had a chance to dig into it myself. Staying within the realm of devices controlling other devices, another way to go DAWless is to get into modular. This is a field that I don't have a ton of experience with, so I'm going to only touch on it briefly, and this can also be a gigantic black hole for money and time, so approach with caution. But people will sequence and build these incredibly complex, evolving, textured DAWless jams using modular, where you have modules that act as sequencers, as idea generators, and then they'll have stuff as sound sources, like analog synthesis, digital oscillators, percussion, physical modeling, and a whole host of other stuff. This, of course, can take a ton of different forms. The whole point of modular is that you basically construct your own setup out of a bunch of different modules that all interconnect and can all be swapped in and out depending on how you want your setup to operate. Once again, this is not my area of expertise, so let's move on to one final way of doing DAWless music that I want to touch on. I'm sure there are other hybrid setups and other stuff that I could discuss, but the final one that I want to talk about is live looping. The way this works is you have your central hub of your station be a live looper, and then you have inputs for synthesizers, drum machines, and live instruments. And you can basically build up a song live on the fly, and this can be a very fun, inspiring setup for some people, especially if you're a bit more of an experienced musician. I did an entire video on this that I'll link at the end of this video. This is something I don't see talked about a ton in kind of the DAWless and synth nerd community, so I figured it was worth talking about. I've also seen some people do hybrid approaches with looping. So someone who's great at this is Mark Rebier on YouTube. He will use his laptop with a MIDI controller as kind of like an endless source of sounds, and then he'll record that into a hardware looper and build songs on the fly from that. And of course, he's a very talented musician, and he can get away with doing this stuff entirely live and on the fly. And then someone else I want to mention who is basically like the king of looping is Beardy Man, although his setup is a whole lot more complex. The methods that I've just mentioned are ways to go entirely without the computer, although the computer has crept in a couple of places already. And I want to quickly touch on hybrid workflows. For instance, with groove boxes, some of them allow you to record the individual tracks into your computer, whether exporting them onto an SD card or recording them in live. The Electribe can do the SD card, the Roland MC101 and 707 and MV1 can all do that, for instance. And if you're trying to make music with hardware synths, you don't necessarily have to go DAWless. Nothing's stopping you from just multi-track recording one synth into your DAW a bunch, and that can actually be a really inspiring way to work. And I'll touch on when a hybrid workflow would be preferable in the section on why not to go DAWless. First of all, some reasons that maybe you should go DAWless. If it's something you're considering, here are kind of the pros of going DAWless. The biggest reason, in my opinion, to go DAWless, and the thing that really draws me to it, is the fact that it is hands-on. You are hitting physical pads or keys, shaping a sound with physical knobs, using physical forms of sequencing even. It is a very hands-on workflow, and that can be super nice, especially if you use a computer all day in your day job like I do. You can often go a bit more by feel when making music like this and just tinker, and that's really appealing, and that can be incredibly fun. I'm not saying it's like morally superior to making music in a DAW, because I don't think that's the case in the slightest, but it being more hands-on can often make it more fun. Another reason to get into DAWless music production is a unique sound, and this can come in a few forms. First of all, there's having a fully or mostly analog setup. If people really like the idea of having all analog synths and drum machines all routed in an analog way, that can be cool. I'm not going to say that it's better. I think at this point, most people just can't tell the difference between digital and analog stuff, but some people find kind of the intangible value of that appealing, and it can sound quite nice. And of course, there's just more unique stuff. There are synths like the Micro Freak and much more expensive synths that can give you some very unique sounds and sound signatures that you can't get anywhere else. And of course, modular gets deep into experimental territory and can often produce some pretty wild stuff. If you end up going the Groovebox route and stay with a self-contained kind of setup, you might find DAWless production appealing because it's incredibly minimalist and incredibly portable and hands-on. This is the case for me. This is why I love Grooveboxes so much. I love a portable, hands-on, minimalist setup where I can make music anywhere and have a little studio just contained in something that can fit in a backpack. And finally, some people will get into modular just for the challenge of it, which it definitely can be hard to get all this stuff working in conjunction, especially as setups get bigger and bigger. For me, I love working within the constraints of a small device and trying to get the most out of a small setup. Other people will enjoy trying to route something and get a lot of power out of a lot of devices, all kind of working in conjunction. The challenge is part of the appeal of DAWless music production and should not be discarded. And if you don't find the challenge appealing, then maybe you want to consider adopting a hybrid approach or just stay within the DAW. Now let's move on to some reasons not to go DAWless, and potentially controversially, bad reasons to go DAWless, and I'll get into that in a second. But first of all, the main reason you might not want to go DAWless is that it just isn't necessary. I mentioned hybrid workflows in the past. You might just have like one or two hardware synths and just want to record them. So just record them into your DAW and go from there, and don't worry too much about having a completely DAWless setup if you don't particularly care about it. If you want it to be in perfect time, you can still sequence it via MIDI and just multi-track it from there. Another invalid reason to go DAWless, and bear in mind that this is strictly my opinion and some people will disagree strongly with me, is better sound. And by that I mean some people might be tempted to get into DAWless music production because they think it'll get you from the cold digital sound of a DAW and into purely analog stuff with the best cables and converters and analog oscillators and all that kind of stuff. In my opinion, that's kind of bogus. DAWless jams pretty much always end up sounding a little more rough around the edges, a little dirtier, maybe a little bit more lo-fi in aesthetic, not in technical sound, but just a little more of a lo-fi aesthetic. And that's because you just don't have as much control over every individual bit of your sound, and you often can't change it after you've made it. Whereas in a DAW, you can really dive in, sculpt a sound, cut frequencies very precisely where you need to, dial stuff in, master it properly, and and all that kind of stuff. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people can't tell the difference between analog and digital sound, and if they do happen to notice the difference, a lot of people simply won't care. Going into a DAWless setup is mostly for you, the producer, and less for the listener. If you are trying to make visual stuff as well, that might play into it, and then it becomes a little more for the consumer as well. But DAWless setups are much more for the benefit of the user than for the listener. Usually, adopting some sort of hybrid setup will result in a better sound. And this is the primary advantage that DAW or hybrid DAW hardware setups have over DAWless setups is more control and more polish, and that's really the key here. If you are trying to make polished, professional quality music for the dance floor or for an album or for the Spotify playlist, you're probably not going to get quite as much control as you want out of a DAWless setup, and it's probably better to give yourself some options to work with stuff in post, to EQ stuff, to mix stuff, add effects, optimize a mix to work well for a master. All this kind of stuff is an advantage of a DAW setup or a hybrid setup. Once again, working with groove boxes can work quite well for this, or multi-tracking multiple synths and drum machines into a DAW so that you can mix them after the fact is a good idea. If you do end up going fully DAWless because you like the idea of it, you like the challenge, and you even like the sound, you should be aware that you are embracing a slightly less polished aesthetic, maybe a little more rough around the edges, and you're going to have to be okay with that. And the more control and polish you try to get out of a purely DAWless setup, the more money it's going to cost and the more devices it's going to take. And that's the other reason not to get into DAWless stuff is the cost. It can become a bit of a money pit as you realize, oh, I need this extra cable, I need an effects unit for this, I need a way to sequence this, I need a way to connect this, I want additional layers, and so I need additional synthesizers for that, I need this kind of sound, and so I've got to buy a whole other device for that. You can go down this rabbit hole pretty deeply, and it can start to really hurt your wallet if you're not careful. And so that's why, once again, I really like minimalist setups. Overall, I like the fact that electronic music in its current form is very low overhead. So I would try to buy stuff that you can really grow into and stuff that is versatile. If you're a bit newer to electronic music production or you have less disposable income and you still want to go DAWless, I would consider just getting a groove box and sticking with a self-contained workflow for a while until you know that you have the knowledge and the money to expand your setup. If, on the other hand, you're a bit more experienced and you're thinking of taking the plunge and going DAWless, just be aware that it can be a money pit and it can have quite a steep learning curve depending on how complex you want your setup to be. This is not necessarily meant to deter you. This is just something that's really good to know going in so you can prioritize exactly how you want to build your setup and whether or not you're really committed to ditching the DAW. Because while I have done a lot of DAWless stuff, I've ended up determining that I'm not committed to ditching the DAW. For looping jams and groovebox jams, it can be fun to ditch the DAW, and I do enjoy that kind of challenge and do engage in it quite frequently, but it's not the only way that I make music these days, and I'm often experimenting with a lot of different setups and processes. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see some more related videos, you can click or tap up over here somewhere, and be sure to leave a comment below on what setup you find the most appealing. I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. So in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Peace. These groove boxes often have groove boxes. There we go. Jeez.